in San Diego, everyone just has their eyes on LA, and it's almost like sad because they're ignoring the potential that is in San Diego. And that's something where like Mika and I are always thinking about, like seeing MFA students now that come and go, now that we're out of the program. They're always like, oh, there's always a few where like, we need to be in LA every weekend, every other weekend. We got to see these shows. We got to network and make connections. And it's kind of like, well, you could also like do a little bit of that here. So many people are living and working here, and they have their galleries in LA, but they
Yeah.
just live here.
Oh
So
wow. Like
yeah,
artists that are represented in LA, you mean, or people that run spaces?
yeah, I like probably like the representation.
Hmm.
Um, I know there are like, professors are like a funny different thing. A lot of our professors who teach here maybe have like an apartment here, but they like really live and work in LA sort of vibe.
Welcome to What's My Thesis. I'm Javier Proenza, and today my guest is Cat Gunn in San Diego. We go back spiritually a long time because I'm good friends with Mika, Naomi, and a bunch of people that you kick it with down south, who were kind enough to make it to the make the trip up to see the What's My Thesis show at
Mhm.
Orange County College. But you're part of Harvest and Gather,
Mhm.
and you are helping OPAF organize the latest iteration of OPAF, which is going to be OPAF South. Now, as someone from the Dirty South, it means a lot to me, but the Dirty South is the East Coast Dirty South, not the West Coast Dirty South. But maybe we can get into San Diego doesn't seem dirty, but what's it called? Yeah, good to have you on the show, Kat. How have you been since OPAF? I haven't seen you since then,
Oh
which
my
is where
God.
we met.
Yeah, that was like what, September? So
Yes.
I think I teach at UCSD, so I think like teaching had maybe just started at that point
Oh
or
wow.
beginning. And I'm very grateful. I got teaching contracts pretty soon after my MFA, which was like graduated in 2023, started teaching 6 months later. But
Hmm.
my spring quarter and semester just ends up like I'm like teaching 8 classes right now, which
How did you find the time to do this?
um I think like a lot of luck and
Well, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were so busy. I would have been. I got sick before the last recording, so well, no one cares, so I shouldn't even bring it up. Uh, well, cool. Tell me. Okay, so where do we start? I guess always with the art origin story. So when did you get into art? When did you start having an inkling about art being an identity? I just talked to Christopher Anthony Velasco, and I feel weird saying this because I'm not queer, but the way that he framed it, which is relevant to my experience with art, is that he kind of had to come out. Like, it's not an easy thing to just be like, I'm an artist. Like, I'm going to be poor.
right, exactly. I think it was
um,
hmm, like when
Go
Pokemon
ahead.
came to America, I had like a very like visceral something happen in my like 4-year-old body where I was like, this is the best thing I've ever seen. I need to like, I'm dedicating all of my being and like energy into like this animated show.
Yeah, yeah.
And there was just something about like, I don't know, like it was like I've even like rewatched like those beginning episodes and I'm like, they're like still kind of like funny and campy. I think I've always loved the sort of like character creation of like Pokemon, even though they're like overall compared to like other fictional mythological animated creatures, they're like quite simple, but there's just something so charming about them. And
Yeah.
the youngest of four siblings, and my siblings are like 14, 12, and like 6 years older than me. So they were also like raising me. And I remember like my sisters would like buy me drawing pads and I would just sit in front of the TV and like pause it so I could like draw whatever Pokemon battle was on the screen.
Oh, wow. So you were getting action shots.
Oh yeah. And that was like, like kindergarten. And something about that, like I just like never really had stopped drawing. Not that drawing is like the most like primary point of my practice these days, but like it was always the starting point.
Hmm.
And I think like I had always thought about being an animator for like TV shows or video games. And then I think I got to like middle school and realized that there's just so much like computer work in that. And I really did not like computers. Beyond like, playing games on computers, I really can't get into like the programming. Like, even sometimes I'm like, should I like figure out like how to use Blender, and then I'm very quickly like, this is like not for me at this moment of time.
Yeah. No, it's pretty crazy. Just the whole. I mean, I know somebody who did a hand drawn thing, and when they told me how many. I mean, I guess it's 24 frames per second, so that's a lot of drawings, and that's a lot of the same drawing. You know, like for me, I love music, but I didn't want to. To me, the idea of like performing the same song over and over again just seemed daunting, and I think animation falls in that same category for me. So tell me about your practice now. How did that evolve from drawing? I actually, you know what? I actually have a pretty blank idea. I don't really know what your work is. I follow you on Instagram, but you know how that thing happens where like you follow people, but then they drop out of your algorithm because you're not like actively interacting with them. I'm kind of a blank slate. So tell us a little bit about what you got going on. I think I know you more as a curator, which I respect, you know, because family got to stick together, you know.
Curating ain't easy when you're doing like all this other stuff too. I feel like so funny calling myself a curator. I'm like, yeah, I'm like a curator. Like,
yeah.
At the end, but so like these days, I guess I'm somewhere in this interdisciplinary realm of like installation, sculpture, but it's all through this like very painterly lens. Like before grad school, I was just a painter,
Mm.
and I really applied to the MFA at UCSD as like this way of expanding my practice. And I always knew I wanted an MFA because I always knew I wanted to teach. But I had just like done so much with like abstract painting. I was really invested in like the alchemy of painting and how you can like, especially with all these like mediums and pigments coming out, how you can like make your own paint, build it up, break it down. And I was thinking a lot about like alchemy and transformative processes as it sort of relates to my own queerness and transness.
Mm.
And then I was like sort of seeing like, oh, well, if I wanted to expand my practice into something else, like, you know, maybe that's something I could do in grad school with those formal resources, like these studios that I'd already be paying for basically. But I guess like through like thinking about what that could look like, ceramics was like the way that I was like seeing an entry point, especially with how certain glazes and glaze chemistry was really sort of popping off. Like everyone was interested in like big drips and gloops and like cracks and all the things that like you don't want in ceramics typically suddenly became like, how do we push that and make it like 20 times more apparent? So that was like my entry point. And then I still really love working with ceramics, but I think I shifted from just this abstract painterly way of working to where I'm like thinking a lot about like objecthoods and still like the transformation as it happens, maybe like in a psychological level, just as like association and objecthood. I've lately been investigating the altar a lot and like altars around like what we even consider an altar, how an altar
Like
can
worship, altar for worship, or altar as an alternate persona.
Oh, like for worship, like ancestral,
Okay.
like altars.
No. Yeah. You were already heading towards answering that question, but I had already started asking it. So go ahead.
Oh my God, no, it's your podcast, your facilitator.
Yes, I am the tyrant here. So would you? I don't know. Like, it seems like in my generation of school, conceptual artist was like a buzzword that people use. You didn't necessarily say that, but like, has that fallen out of favor? Is that because it was so fucking trendy when I was a kid?
Yeah, I feel like now people like that sounds like a meme where it's like conceptual artists under the like guys where like all artists are technically conceptual.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also like I have a really kind of like maybe bitter association with the term conceptual artist because I dated someone in undergrad who became a conceptual artist once they like learned.
Fuck them and all conceptual artists then.
Yeah, and then I was like, they were like, "You're like married with kids when it comes to painting. I'm not that in it." And I was like, "Why are you saying that like it's an insult? I'm just invested in my practice."
Yeah, there's a little bit of like hermetic practices like Aleister Crowley and like all of that, like kind of there's like a little element to that with conceptual artists where you have to like break down something to a point for it to be sophisticated enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you know, which where it's like I think that like magicians in general, like if Alan Moore, I love, and what's his name, Grant Morrison, which who are like forever beefing dudes because they are basically the same kind of guy, so they're like almost in each other's lane, so they hate each other. They're both magicians of very, I think they're both chaos magicians, but to me it's just funny the disdain that people have for that, but when you were talking about it, I mean, you would have passed my classes the way that you were talking about the materiality, you know, like you would have fit in, but I think that we've gone past that, and I'm just an old guy who still kind of identifies by that meme because that's what I was taught. I didn't learn anything else in life.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about San Diego and that scene, because you guys are doing some stuff to like kind of, I mean, everything sucked after COVID, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I even LA is still kind of struggling, especially in the artist run scene. It's still quite not what it was before.
Mhm.
But tell me a little bit about the scene there. Like, is it, I mean, I can't imagine. Like, one of the things that happens to me out here in LA is I keep seeing all the new shows that people post in their Instagram, and I always look at the list of artists, and I'm like, I don't know a single one of these people. And to me, that's so exciting because it's like the fucking Great Expanse. I'm never gonna run out of guests, right?
Yeah.
Like, like I've only recently started to have people back on because I was like, for a while, it was just so it was just automatic to kind of get new people. How big would you say the art scene is down there in San Diego?
It's so San Diego is like a city that is like big because it's so spread out. I feel like
Uh
driving anywhere that is like, I don't know, a 15-minute drive, you're driving like 15 to 20 miles, it feels like.
oh,
Unless you're
okay.
deep in like the city and you're just like, at every stoplight. But I think like I don't want to say it's like a small art scene because of how big it is. And there's so many, like, there's like the art scene and then there's like all those subcultures within it, right? But it's like fairly like intimate, I think. Like you go to like some openings, there's like not the most robust gallery scene down here. Even like the museums, it's like there's a solid handful of like art museums specifically that put on like shows of contemporary artists, but it's all I think like kind of like modest and intimate, but I come from Baltimore. Like that's where I was before I moved for the MFA. And so
Did you go to Micah in
no.
Baltimore? No. Okay. Just
I went
just
to
asking.
Yeah, I went to Towson University just north of Baltimore.
Okay.
Um, but they had like a great art department, so I was happy to be at like a cheaper school that still had amazing facilities. Um, but yeah, Baltimore is just like a small city in general. Like it made sense for me to be biking around Baltimore. Here, I'm like, I don't know, like I'm always going too far to like really want my bike with all my stuff on it. Um, but the like energy that I felt in the Baltimore kind of like the DIY aspects of that art scene and how it's just kind of like scrappy artists having scrappy galleries and like making something work.
Yeah.
Um, always felt so exciting to me, and that's kind of like where my interest in galleries always lied and like showing work. And I guess from there, just looking at like a few artists I was admiring and like like those galleries like Springsteen or like Resort, which I think is closed, or I interned very briefly with a space called Tarot Contemporary. But I always had this dream of being like, oh, at some point when I'm able, I want to like have an artist run space and like, do these curating shows. And I just always thought it was a sweet gesture to be like, oh, like I love your work so much. And it's kind of like someone believing in your practice kind of gives you the will to go on. So you're like, oh, yeah, I do like want to like share my work in the space if our ethos are matching. And I
Yeah.
felt similar energy in San Diego, which is what kind of kept me here. Um, but because we're like not, in LA County or in New York, like the funding opportunities are just so like slim to nothing sometimes.
Yeah.
So it makes it really hard, which is why I'm really happy that Mika and I connected and kind of like just like having coffee one day after graduating and both being in like the unemployment limbo, I think. We were like at some lesbian owned coffee shop and they had this idea for starting a residency, I think back in their home in the valley, their family home, and I wanted to start this gallery in a garage of a new apartment we were moving into, but then the garage was like kind of ugly, so I would have had to like really fix up the walls, and there was like these really weird storage build outs that were like super clunky and like kind of bug infested. And then the spot right across from my garage was like a notorious dumping ground. So like every week there was just huge piles of like clothes and food trash, and like then like a sofa or like an old table until like the city came to pick it up. So I was like, I don't really know how I feel inviting artists now to like show my, like garage gallery if like 15 feet away there's like a heaping pile of trash with like flies all around it.
Oh,
Like,
gross. Yeah.
yeah, and then like then inviting like people for the openings where I'm like, it feels like I'm inviting people to like this mini dump in my alleyway or something. Um, but
Do you know there's a venue over here that I've never been to, but it's called The Smell. It's like a punk venue that's really popular. And it's
this
it's all ages. So but it's called The Smell because it smells bad. But
on
it's
brand for like a punk venue.
but yeah, but I don't know. I don't know how much you want to like the fly. If it was just trash, I get it. That would be one thing. But the flies, yeah, that's not.
Yeah,
Especially especially when it gets hotter. Like yeah. So then that's how you guys. So you guys figured out harvest and gather. I shout out to Mika. So one of the things that was very validating to me recently, we were talking about validation of practice, was just the show at Orange Coast College at the Frank M. Dole Pavilion. But one of the things that Mika was telling me is that you guys, after OPAF, you like started it. Like how easy was the transition to like talking about bringing OPAF down? And what's it like to work with an organization that's been around like that? You guys are pretty new. Is there like, I mean, Kay is like one of the most generous people that I know in this space, so that must be a pretty big thrill, right? Like it must feel like you have like an older sibling kind of being like, oh yeah, no, all this shit sucks. You're gonna hate your life, but you're gonna have fun too, and this is how you avoid that misery.
exactly. And I think that sort of honesty with Kay is like what we also need, where it's not just like, and then you just do this, and then eventually, like, you'll just be
Yeah,
fine if your bills are paid. Like the when people can admit that it's like, and like Kay has done it for so long that she's like, oh, I've got it down. Like I know what I'm doing. I know how long it
yeah.
takes, whatever, whatever. But she has been so generous with like showing us like her like documents, how she kind of like talks about planning and like kind of like thinking about how you can coordinate with like another venue to like help host and like then further host like all the other artists, and even just like her ethos, like thinking about like, yes, with anything there's like money involved, but she really prefaces like, oh, like staffing at an event like this is a must, but I always choose to like staff other artists because like artists need more than just a gallery show. They also need ways of like making money to sustain their livelihoods. And so even just thinking about that, I was like, that makes so much sense. And it's like a small part of the equation, or maybe a big part, that I like maybe hadn't thought about so concretely.
Yeah.
Um, and so just like through that guidance, it's like really nice and inspiring, especially because I feel like OPAF is something where there is a structure, but there is so much fluidity in how that structure could be and how it can exist in these spaces. And for myself, I think that's something like that adaptability is always really kind of necessary.
Mhm.
So like the nice part about doing this curio project with someone, especially with someone like Mika, is that it's kind of like the moments where I start to like have those like sort of self-doubts, like Mika maybe is on the same page and we're both like, oh, okay, it's not just me, like we're just both,
Yeah, yeah.
or maybe even like we're just like affirming, or I don't know, certain weird situations where like it kind of feels weird to say yes or no yet. It's like, oh well, it's not just me. I have to like talk to my partner or something.
Oh
Um
yeah, and that makes it stronger too, though. Especially, one of the things that is really good also about the moment of working with Kay is that like I don't know how long it's been. I think I interviewed her last year or the year before that, but basically she's entering the new stage, right? Like as I interview more and more people, I just interviewed somebody in a commercial space, and they were Tyler Park Presents is the space. They were learning under very famous gallery over here called Francois Guy Bali. Was like he was saying it's kind of bordering on blue chip level, but he was talking about how Francois was a small thing one
Mhm.
time at one point, you know. And so it's interesting because like I think that the habit of this thing is to just sort of expect, especially coming out of the pandemic when so many of these efforts died out just outright. It became it's interesting to see, you know, like at one point I almost quit doing the show. And then now I'm entering that, like the long stretch. It's like the you start off and you're like, you got all that enthusiasm, but then once you have that practicality of somebody that's like, no, 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 no. Okay, so this is fucking happening. I can't not do this because I will be sad. And so now I need to figure out the functionality of it, and then being paired off with somebody that knows that. I mean, that's one of the craziest mentorships. I'm excited for you guys because I just know the resources that you have access to sort of make something happen down there. And then combining, one of the other things that I've learned is that like, you know, Dakota, super well known person in the community, us doing that show at OCC has raised my profile because people are like, "Oh, you guys are working together." So those are two like people that, you know. I mean, I'm assuming some people like me. I'm sure that some people hate me. I'm sure that some people just shit on as part of it, and they have every right to. Like, fuck it. It's if it's not for them, have at it. Shit all over me, just not in my comments because they hurt my feelings. But it is a really exciting thing. I think that it not only helps you guys to be associated with OPAF, but OPAF gets something out of interacting with a community, like a newer community in San Diego like that. So I think that it's a really interesting partnership. Can you tell me a little bit more about the ethos of Harvest and Gather? I'm gonna just give a little bit. Like, you guys did one show that I wanted to participate in, but I just didn't have time to get my shit together.
Mhm.
And there was like a bonfire where you guys burnt art at the end of it. Tell me a little
Oh,
bit about that.
it was sick.
Because I want people to get an idea. Because the other thing that's important that I've been doing is like, yeah, I'm interviewing people in the commercial space now and all of that. But if I only do that, then there's this whole community of people that get left out that are doing things that the commercial spaces can't. And artists that participate in these commercial spaces still use or still participate in the artist run scene because it gives them opportunities to make things maybe more political, less commercially restricted by what the by what the collector base of the gallery that you're represented by, you know. So yeah, tell me a little bit about what your project is, because I mean, we definitely want to highlight it, and we definitely love the people involved in it.
Yeah, so with Harvest and Gather, I think I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but like when we were at that like lesbian-owned coffee shop, we just kind of were like, "Oh, should we like because our, they couldn't do their residency, I couldn't do my garage gallery. It's like, should we do something like together?" And then we kind of like set these very general ground rules around like, well, we both know we operate with the same ethos around like wanting to uplift like, marginalized voices, which sounds like such a buzz, like DEI phrase right now. But it's like, how can we like give like space for queer folks to like people of color to people that are always like in these margins in the art world, and how can we maybe like let them show their work in these more alternative spaces? And oftentimes that's like outside because we're
Yeah.
new. We've just been doing this for like a year and like a few months, really, like maybe like 15 months total. But we are also kind of interested in like how can we do this with like extremely modest means and still have really kind of productive discourse come out of it. So like, we have like shown, and like I think our first show was in this park at a structure called the Witch's Tower. So it's kind of like, okay, like it's October, this is kind of like weird and spooky, and there was like a really kind of, we thought, we kind of hoped people would show some work on Witch's Tower, but it ended up being like a kind of like weird spiritual energy, and everyone was like, yeah, I don't think we're actually going to put work on there, I'm going to go hang out in these palms over here. And we were like, that's thank you. But we were really just like we want to do this as long as it also feels good for both of us. So we're kind of like, once it just stops feeling good, we will probably just like opt out. Not that it's always smiles and rainbows. Like there are certainly moments where like things are annoying or kind of trying, but like, you know, it's still like never enough to be like, this project is dying necessarily.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, you know,
Well,
just like,
anytime. I mean,
awesome.
I will say I don't have a collaborator. I used to, so I totally understand what you're saying. It really is hard to see eye to eye on everything, and you know. But I would keep it to just you two, because the more cooks you have in the kitchen, the more it gets crazy. But yeah, and so the ethos is marginalized opportunities, which I think that like it's sort of it's an interesting thing. I don't necessarily voice it like that. I don't say like, oh, this is what my, but if you look at the people I have, it's pretty
Right?
clear that I'm not like what my interests are. And I think that it does an interesting thing to do that. Uh it gives you leeway to be outwardly political in a way that people might disagree, and then but then you can't be your intentions. You can't be called a right winger.
Right?
you
There's
know, you know what if.
there's just also this thing with San Diego where it is large and there is like so much space. And we are always looking at like these random storefronts on main roads. And it's like, there's this funny one that's like an old chop suey restaurant. And it has this kind of like faux Asian gate kind of like construction in front of it. And this huge neon sign that says chop suey. And like that was
Mm.
one of my first favorite songs by System of a Down when I was 5. So I'm always like nostalgic when I
You were
pass.
5 when that came out. Jesus Christ, dude! You don't even remember the Iraq War, what that was about.
I remember like barely what that was about, but like, yeah. I don't know. I don't know if I was 5 when that song came out. I just remember hearing it as a child, and my
Is
brother was like, "You love that song," and I was like, "I love this song because you said so."
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that
So
song is great. Yeah, yeah.
it still stands up to this day, I think.
Dude, that whole album is like,
Yes,
yeah,
yes, that whole
it's that whole album serves as a document to what people that I now disagree with on a lot of things used to believe in during the Iraq War, right? And it's a crazy thing where like new generations are born, and they're born into this like absence of knowledge of what just happened. Like it's hard for you guys to really understand. I don't even begrudge you. It's just how that machine of deception works, right? Where like the propaganda is so strong that when you're born, you're in that propaganda consumption routine, and then severing yourself from it is like is the real work of being like a true radical.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
a while ago, I've been doing like, you know, every now and again you like think of a band or an album you loved and you're like, I haven't listened to that in like a couple of years. What's up with that? And then you like re-fall in love with it. I did that with System of a Down, I think last fall.
Yeah,
And was just like really looking up. I'm like, okay, I know they're like Armenian, right? So like what's like I was kind of like doing like very light research around like how they all met and like where like all of this like kind of started for them, and just thinking about the Armenian genocide too as probably like a big like, you know, maybe like motivation for why their work is like so sociopolitically like has that like underlying narrative.
yeah.
um but anyways, the yeah, there's just so many. The other thing with Harvest and Gather being more like this nomadic project felt important to us too, because like there's so much development happening in San Diego, and there's like obviously I actually just had to move into a new apartment with my spouse because like there was like structural foundational issues and they needed to tear out all the walls and plumbing, and we were like, I don't know how we're gonna move right now. This like really sucks. It's like the middle of winter. And then
Yeah.
the same rental company was like, we actually just had this new property. Like it's still kind of under construction, but you guys are great tenants. We'll just transfer all your like, you know, security deposit and all your info over. And we were like, yeah, if we don't have to reapply, like this is our only option, so we'll take it. But then
Yeah.
it's like, okay, this is like objectively the nicest apartment I've lived in. I haven't laundry since I moved out from my parents, but like
uh
it's like new appliances, but then I'm also looking at like other buildings kind of near us where there's still so much like development happening. And in San Diego, there's this funny thing where like it's like a very like you're in the city, but it's still like sort of suburban feeling in some
Yeah, yeah,
neighborhoods.
yeah. I grew
Like,
up. I grew up in Miami, so that is natural to
oh,
me. That is a state of being. But I
like
get, I get. If you're from Baltimore, like, what the fuck, you know?
yeah, but then it's like you'll have like neighborhoods where it's like maybe some of the houses have like 3 stories, but it's mostly 2 stories. But then they're like, oh, we're making a new like apartment building, and all of a sudden it's like this 20-story building in the middle of this neighborhood, and you're like, this is ugly. Like
Yeah,
this is also just like they're not going to be affordable. A studio is like almost $3,000 or something in building like those.
yeah, that
We
sucks.
were just also kind of thinking about like as with many other cities, like the gentrification that happens and like how space is really such a like hard thing to come by. So we
Yeah.
were like, okay, well, if we really are going to do this through modest means and kind of like not be moving towards that kind of like gallery museum model, like what can we do instead? And so there have been like many iterations of like outdoor art like pop-up projects like OPAF, but
Hmm.
we were really inspired by it's called SPF 15, run by Morgan Mandalay.
Where
And
out of where? Out of San Diego or LA?
San Diego, yeah, it was happening when he went to the MFA at UCSD like years before us. But Morgan's a painter. I really happen to love his work, and he was just like really generous, like chatting with me about like how he did that project. And he was like, "Oh yeah, my goal was like I bought a canopy tent for like $100, and all of the shows had that structure to sort of work off of, but he did it specifically on beaches. So
Oh,
beach
nice.
San Diego would like invite a few artists. And he had like some really cool names on there, but like people would like there's like this one beach here called Black's Beach, and you have to climb down this kind of like intense cliff hike situation. But then you get down to Black's Beach and it's like a nude beach, so it's like, okay, like no wonder there's like this huge cliff, like everyone's naked
Yeah,
at the
yeah, yeah. It's like the perfect spot for that.
yeah, but he had a show where he talked about an artist burning, I think, Nagchampa incense, and the whole time you go down the hike, you can like smell it wafting up, and then you
Mhm.
finally get to the tent and you see like the incense burning with like the other objects and sculptures. Um,
So it's
but
like like an alluring introduction. You see you see the show before you get to it.
exactly, like some sense of like you're already becoming immersed before you even see the thing or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
So you mentioned our bonfire show, so that was like a beach show that we did. Just kind of like based around we're always sort of like at a coffee shop spitballing where it's like, oh, what if we like I saw this abandoned parking lot. What if we told everyone to like bring their cars and everyone does a car installation? Or like, oh, there's this one motel with a cool name. What if we rented a room and did a motel show or something? And that's kind of how they all start in one way or another. It's like sometimes Mika's like, I was just at the park and this like grove of trees looked really beautiful or something. Um, and
Well,
like
Mika's a great partner because there is nobody that I know that is more of like an open vein, you know, like just like it's almost like you got to be like I almost want to protect. You know, like cruel world, they're too sensitive. Like in a good way. I don't mean that as like a dig. I mean that like and what they have that's amazing is their pride in that, you know? Like
Mhm.
they were talking about it in their interview is like they lost the ability to cry to people's work. I'm like I just love that, you know? And especially like it's I don't know. I think it's healthy to encourage people be like use their superpowers, and I think that it is sort of their superpower, you know.
It's definitely something that I have learned a lot from. So like selfishly when we were like starting Harvest and Gather, I was like, how can I like stay in your orbit just a little bit more? Because like, grad school, you kind of like people drift apart and maybe you see someone like once a month if they're in the same city.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
now I get to like stay talking to this like person in grad school who's like also like looking at Mika's work really transformed my practice and whatever. But yeah, the so we did this like bonfire show. Um and like you mentioned, like we were like lighting artworks on fire. So we were kind of like, oh, what can we do? Like we both like going to the beach and we like Ocean Beach in San
Hmm.
Diego and they have these fire pits. So we were like at the beach one time with our friends, and I think Mika maybe was just like, I bet we could get here early enough to like reserve a fire pit for ourselves and we could like do a show around that. And then it was like, oh, and then what if we like, for the snacks, like we could get like hot dogs and like marshmallows and make s'mores. And then like it could be like a sunset show so that we could really enjoy the bonfire. And then it became like just like a really great kind of like all day thing. So like I don't know if you know Audrey Higa, right?
No.
She okay. She had came down. I think she's another person associated with CSUN.
Okay.
And like had this like ceramic sculpture from her thesis show that she's like, I just want to like set it on fire. So like pair of like legs that were kind of uncanny because they also kind of match the color of the sand a bit, and like we threw it in the fire pit and just like kind of like let them burn as people were like roasting their marshmallows. Or Andrew Wharton, who's one of the current MFA students, had these sort of like casts that were like made of wax that kind of looked like eggs or something, and he wanted to set those on fire so that the wax would like drip down into the sand and just become melted as the bonfire was happening. Um, so it's also really just like another space that I really liked in Baltimore was called Syndicate. And that was run by Tim Dowd and Zoe Charlton. And I entered for them very briefly just to kind of like, I'm really curious about like how a gallery even runs. But they were kind of like their model was that they would have studio visits with artists and then ask them to show something that is like beyond their usual scope of the practice. And they're like, we want you to show something more experimental. So
Yeah.
it was always sort of like just beyond like an artist would something just beyond what they would send out to a gallery is like what their shows were built off of. And I think with Harvest and Gather, I don't know, I guess like people like certainly are like, oh, it'd be cool to like show this outside, but like naturally you're not gonna like just like bring your work to a park and start installing it and take pictures. And so then they're like,
Mm.
oh, well, now I'm in this random group show with this nomadic curatorial project, and now my work is outside, and it's like, changing with like how the sunlight is coming through the leaves or something, and it's like illuminating with these beautiful shadows, or like maybe the wind is blowing my work in a beautiful way. And like, it's just this way of also moving away from maybe like institutional violence of museums and galleries.
Well, I mean,
Um,
there's a lot just with burning the bonfire show. Sorry, the burning show.
mm,
Because look,
burning light.
I already alluded to the fact that there are things that you can do that a commercial space can't. Right? Like
Mhm,
there's no monetary gain from that process. So then there's this ritualistic thing that's happening where you are taking labor
mhm,
that begets an object. Beget is like births, right? That's all the begets in the in the Bible. I'm
mhm,
asking. I'm not condescending. I'm just clarifying to make sure that that makes sense. So that and then at the end, it's this temporal thing where I don't know. Was documentation a big part of the process? So then the only thing that's left of these objects is the process of burning them. There's like a ritualistic thing that
mhm.
I think again relates to that magical stuff that I was referring to of conceptual art, right? Like where it's like we are above money. I mean, but our labor is still worth it, and it labor for to benefit experiences, labor for community. There's so many different things that happen when you not only um like show work outside of that space, but you're taking that work and you are lighting it on fire. That is there's like a weird spiritual surrender element to that, right? Like it almost goes back to like maybe Christianity or paganism, right? When it was like early shit where it was like a cult,
Mhm.
right? Like so
Yeah.
yeah, so I like the occultist element of it, which is the thing that is one of the reasons that I like to highlight you guys and things like OPAF, because it's like it's just a different space, it's just a
Mhm.
different art community, and people want to be cool. So
Right?
if
And it's
something cool is happening, even the commercial people want to be part of it, right?
right. And it's very much like honestly just an extension of both of our practices kind of mashed up together. Where like,
Mm,
you mentioned something about like this like gathering and like laboring for things. And that's very much what I feel like is central in Mika's practice, where they are always creating these like environments, installations, and sets where then they invite people to maybe like perform a play that they co-write, or like, just like perform their own performances within Mika space, or maybe it's like also a bar or a party or something that people are all hanging out in. And then mine with like this idea of like an altar and like this like, the occultism within that and like sort of like staging various arrangements until it like resembles something altar like. And
Yeah.
also this idea of like this can happen anywhere in the world. Like I have always really loved seeing it's like, I mean, I don't want to say I love seeing it because it's always coming from something so sad, but like the roadside altars that you see pop up, and like when you see that there are like new objects that have been appearing, like new candles, new flowers, new photos or whatever, it's like kind of sweet to see that people are still visiting the site where something so tragic happened, like someone dying in a car crash or a bike accident. But
But
through
it, go ahead.
oh,
Sorry.
oh no, I was just gonna say that, but like, through this way where like we're taking this idea of like this could happen anywhere in the world, and we can also like host people, and then like many other elements. Like we both work with like faux walls or like platforms or like modest wooden structures, and sometimes we're like we do want maybe more of a structure like what we had at OPAF in San Pedro or whatever. So we're like we're going to bring some like theater looking flats. They're not going to be that
Mm.
fancy. They're a little janky, but janky is also part of the brand. So then
Yeah, yeah.
be
No,
good in
yeah.
some paintings or like elevate sculptures off the cement or something.
I mean, I've been to art fairs that aren't janky and they're still kind of janky. You know?
Right?
The other thing that I would say that's really interesting that just kind of occurred to me is that there is sort of like this, like adding to the occult element of it. There is like the thing about bonfires, right? There's a long history of like Guy Fawkes Day and shit like that, right? Where it's all about, but then there's also the Bilderberg group where they light an effigy on fire, and that group was kind of I mean, not that this is what influenced it, but there's layers to it, right? Where it's like this like it's like you're worshiping at the altar of an art god, which I think is like it's an interesting way of like, you know what a tulpa is? A tulpa is an energy thought form that comes to life. So it's like some people would say, and I don't mean this to offend anybody that's super religious, but some people would say that Jesus Christ is a tulpa, where it's like maybe he did or didn't exist, but at this point it's kind of hard to tell. And whatever he's become, it has become this other thing. Santa Claus would be a tulpa for children. To children, he's very real, and it affects their behavior and stuff like that. So the idea of this occult, like instead of Molech, which is the owl god from the Bilderberg events, like just this idea of like what are we worshiping at? Like what altar is this? You know, I don't know. To me, that's just that, and it doesn't need an answer, but just it's the humanity of the behavior that I think has that more conceptual depth that I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I think when you were saying something about tulpas, I was like, I'm so sure there's an X-Files episode where like their
Oh yeah,
explanation
yeah,
for the thing is like Mulder's like, it's just a tulpa, and then Scully's like, oh, sure, of course. But
yeah,
I
yeah,
think what's like kind of appealing to me and like what you just said is also this way where like, oh, it doesn't have to have an answer. And I kind of love when there's like no one definitive answer, because that expansiveness is
yeah,
I'm always seeking, but also like I feel like I've maybe like my whole existence have like always been sort of hovering between things, whether it's like identities of like gender, being biracial or whatever, or like even within spaces, it's like you're like sort of like there and like, you're in grad school. And so you're sort of like adjacent to like these galleries or other formal spaces, but you're also like, I kind of like am not fully in these spaces. I'm sort of like elsewhere or like hovering between. Um, and maybe like in a sense like placeless but like also everywhere at once.
yeah.
But yeah.
Uh, Tell me a little bit about Baltimore. And you said you were biracial. What's your background?
Oh, I'm Filipino on my mom's side, Scottish on my dad's side. There's a whole bunch of other
Whoa.
things on my side. Gunn is like a Scottish name, so it's the easiest to kind of like
Are
correlate.
you Are you? Did both of your parents have thick accents? Like one with a Filipino accent and one with because that
My mom,
that
so,
monosyllabic Filipino accent is so charming, and because
yeah,
I think the language. No, that's Vietnamese. That's Vietnamese. I'm sorry, I'm confusing cultures. But Tagalog is also its own thing. It kind of has a Spanishy flavor to it.
yeah, exactly.
Did your
My
dad have
mom,
a thick Scottish accent or no?
no, he's
I
actually
wanted the
just,
cartoon version in my mind.
he's very like American of Scottish descent.
Yeah, yeah, I figured, but I was trying to have fun.
No, it would have been so cool if, like, it would have been like maybe the coolest thing about him if he had Scottish.
So and then Baltimore, like what is that city like? What is their art scene like? Because I think you might be the first person I've had that I know Baltimore through people that studied at Micah that I went to school with, and stuff like that. And I know Baltimore from like living, like Baltimore was like essentially the coolest city in the greater Washington, like near like closest city next to Washington D.C. that was cool. Because everything else is just kind of like that weird political bullshit of like, lobbyists. You go to bars and it's just like everybody's so fucking aggro and like it was not a play. Like, dude, I've gotten closer to getting into fights there than I did in Miami, and that shocked me because it's dudes in suits and shit that are like just assholes. So Baltimore has its own like really interesting way of being that it's so close to this big city, but then it's also kind of run down. I remember when I visited. This was in the early 2000s. There were houses that you could buy for like $1, and they were just kind of shells, and you had to like rebuild them. Is that something that I imagined, or was that actually a thing? Am I misremembering that?
I think that's a real thing where I don't know if it's still happening, but yeah, Baltimore's kind of funny in this way where, I mean, I guess it's like not funny because it's all like systemically structurally charged, right? Where
Yeah,
like
yeah.
houses were sort of like built in such a way where like they were going to depreciate really fast and kind of fall apart. And then the families living in them, which are predominantly Black families, would not be able to afford to like fix them up. So they then would be forced to move. So there are so many neighborhoods where there's all these kind of like dilapidated row houses. If you've ever seen like Hairspray or something, it very much is like Good Morning Baltimore. Like that is what Baltimore looks like. Those really skinny, like tall row houses where like when
Is
I also
Hairspray John Waters?
yeah, and
Okay,
John
that makes sense. Yeah,
Lamar,
yeah.
so he's pretty big over there. Um, Baltimore is, well, truthfully, I really grew up like south of Baltimore in one of the counties, but as a young adult, moved into Baltimore and had a few apartments there. And I always say I'm from there because I feel like that's where I became like a real person.
Yeah,
That's where I
yeah, for sure.
kind of like really grew into like more of who I am in my adult self. It's kind of like where I became radicalized. So it is like super intense with the police brutality. Like I have unfortunately on several occasions seen moments where I'm just like driving home from work, whether it was like when I was an Uber Lyft driver, working at Cheesecake Factory as a cook, or when I was an art handler,
I
where
keep
like,
forgetting how old you are. Those jobs didn't exist when I was a kid, so it's just like, oh, that dates me.
yeah, I'm only 31. I'm still,
Okay, yeah, yeah.
but yeah, it's, like I would just be driving home from work and sometimes you're just sitting there in traffic and then you're like, oh my God, there's like 8 cop cars chasing this like one Black guy across the street. Am I really gonna watch someone get gunned down right now?
Yeah.
And when Freddie Gray was like murdered in police custody, I was in undergrad at Towson, and that was kind of like a moment where I think like a bigger picture really started coming together. And that was like the moment I became radicalized. Like my mom is from the Philippines, like from Manila, grew up in poverty. Both of my older sisters were born there, but my mom is definitely someone who both of my parents are boomers. So I think they're
Mm.
sort of like, oh, we know that like, racism's bad. Anyways, and then like we were just in a very assimilated household. I think because of my mom's really hard upbringing in poverty, she was sort of like just like, oh, you guys need to just speak English and only focus on that because that's what's going to help you get further in America, sort of vibe.
So you don't
Um,
speak Tagalog at all?
no, unfortunately. I have like books and I've tried. I used to like beg my mom when I was in middle school to teach me, and she was always
Mm.
like, oh, no, kind of like sounds hard. I don't really want to. And now that she's much older, she kind of like is sad that we don't speak
Yeah.
Tagalog. Um,
My grandmother never spoke English, and that's why I speak such. That's the only reason. Like, if I would have just be a Spanglish person if without her, you know. And then I spent time living with her and stuff. So that's the gift that she gave me as sour of a person and
mhm.
like constant. She's one of those people that like she got to a certain point where if you got her the right medicine to like help her with her depression, it would be like crushing to realize that she could have just been happy this whole time.
Um,
But I still love her, and you know she's like my sweet aristocratic Cuban grandmother,
mm,
whose dad was a judge, and she's very proud of it, you know.
mm.
But uh yeah, like that language thing is it's tricky, man. So your first generation, was she is she an immigrant or did her parents immigrate?
Yeah, my mom's an immigrant. Both of my sisters were also born in Manila, and then
Okay.
I think like once they were like a few years old, my dad and my mom actually got married, and he was a in the Air Force as a Vietnamese linguist back when like Vietnam was a threat sort of vibe, and so
Mm,
they traveled through the Pacific region a lot before I was born. I was eventually born in Honolulu, but I was only there for like a year, and then my family moved to Maryland. So I'm always just like
mm,
I try not to say I was born in Hawaii anymore because usually that leads to people
yeah.
being like, "You're Hawaiian," and I'm like,
Yeah,
"No,
yeah, yeah.
no."
Yeah,
um,
I tell people I was born in DC, but I was only there for a year, but I did live there afterwards, so it's not that. I do know what the city is like, you know, but
mhm.
yeah, I get that. Um, sorry, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that, or
Oh,
because I mean, Baltimore, it was Amsterdam a real thing? Did that shit actually happen? Was that an actual scandal? The for people that don't know what I'm talking about, the Wire show is written by somebody who's like really big in the fan of that city, and there was one season where they basically legalized heroin in just like a one small neighborhood area. Like, did shit like that actually happen? Because I mean, all of that stuff is so crazy deep. Like, all that show is all about the corruption there.
mm,
And one of my favorites is that really smooth talking black politician. I forget what his name is, but he's been in other stuff. But like he's always like, "Hey, baby,"
yeah, I haven't
but
actually seen The Wire, which I'm
oh
kind
my
of.
god,
I had like remembered when it was coming out, and I was just like, "Ugh, they're making a show about this fucking city right now. Like, what do we need to know?" And then there were like random places. Like, I went into a barber shop, and they had this like map of Baltimore, like based on like where The Wire was taking place and like where certain things and certain
wow.
things happened. And I was like, I'm just here for a haircut. I'm not here to read all this. I think it's one of those shows where like now I'm like, oh, maybe I should actually like watch that. Like
Yeah,
now that
I would undersell it for you because everybody's like, "Oh my God, it's the new coming of Christ." The show's good, but it's like it has problems. It has
yeah.
serious character problems. Like some of the characters, like there's a lesbian character in it that I'm not a huge fan of. They just basically wrote a dude that
Mhm.
that was a woman. I mean, from my recollection, I haven't watched it in at least 10 years, but there are some things in it that I was just like, but and like the season, it's not a consistent every season is awesome kind of thing.
Mhm.
But there are some really good seasons along the way.
Yeah.
I would recommend it. But it's interesting, like it's interesting to have a city like that like honestly I've been there and I still feel like I learned quote unquote learned more about that city through that show, you know,
Mm.
which I wouldn't you like it's like being a tourist in LA and going to Hollywood Boulevard and then being like, oh, I know LA, you know.
Yeah. Right. I actually, when I was an Uber Lyft driver, picked up this like much older couple that was like from Virginia. And I was like, oh, like, where you going? What brings you here? Like, the small talk for your driver. And they were just like, oh, well, we're from out of town. We're here on like, a 3-day weekend vacation. And I was like, oh, a vacation in Baltimore. No one vacations in Baltimore on like a conference for like, lawyers or doctors or something, like maybe an anime convention, but like, what are you vacationing for? And they were like,
Yeah.
we just love The Wire so much, and we want
Wow.
a catfish sandwich, and we want you to take us into the hood. And I was like, okay, elderly white couple, like,
Yeah, yeah, that's not good.
and this specific place. And I was like, it's what the GPS is taking me to. I guess I will take you there, but like, very respectfully, like, you are like, understand the space that you're entering, please. But it
It's
was
not a
also,
safari.
yeah, it was also a Sunday. So I'm like quite certain any place you choose is going to be closed because they're like usually the local family places are the ones that are like where they have like the best like fried fish sandwiches or something. So it was closed. And then this like woman was like lamenting to her husband, like, I can't eat at Chili's again. That's not what we came here for. So it was just like this comical, like, I was like, are we really in Baltimore right now? Or like, what do
Oh,
you guys think this city is? And like, for everything else happening in The Wire, you're focusing on the catfish sandwiches.
yeah, dude. No, for sure. That's crazy. They're like, we want to go to the to the boardwalk or whatever, the waterfront. I'm just trying to remember all the details of that show. Every season they kind of focus. That was what the thing that was weird. Every season they kind of focused on a different cultural aspect of the city. So it was like one season was the longshoremen, one season was the press, like the newsroom, and that was the kind of that was like the sixth season. That was my least favorite, but it's just an interesting thing. Tell me a little bit about the art scene, and then also, since you are a queer person, I feel like I always feel like I need to defend Miami and Florida in general because like it's a really queer place that just doesn't get it's like it's startling how people talk about it, like Cubans may be Republican, but they're not as homophobic as the press likes to make it out to be. What was it like being queer in Baltimore? Is it like, was there hostility towards that? Was there progressivism there? Because I mean,
Um,
it's in a liberal state, but that doesn't mean necessarily anything, right? Just the same way that Florida being in Miami being in a Republican state doesn't really change the vibe.
Yeah, I mean, just like with any place else, it's like there are pockets where you really find that community and it feels really like sweet and safe and like mutual aid space. And then there are still moments when you're like, oh, I just heard about, of all places at a protest, like people protesting for the same thing. And now they like jump this trans person because they realized they were trans. Guess I'm not going to that protest.
Yeah, yeah,
But, or at least like not wherever that had happened specifically. But there, like, there was like a specific medical center, I think like called Chase Braxton, that like really specialized in like helping folks get access to like HRT and like trans healthcare. And around the time I really realized like I am trans and I need to like actually do something about it because I can't keep waking up. I was like 26, 27. It was just like I can't like keep living in this body as it is anymore. Like I am too miserable for this. And that's when I really tried to start finding some place, and like I tried to get in contact with Chase Braxton, but they didn't really get back to me until much later. And by that point, it was like COVID was happening. I was moving cross country, peak COVID for grad school. It was all this weird chaos, but the art scene was really, really sweet. And it was part of honestly what made me feel like being an artist was possible. Maybe because it is so DIY and it's like the people who show up are the ones who are supporting other projects too. So it's like everyone sort of has a hand in like uplifting or supporting or like adding to the sustainability or durability of someone else's project, which I loved. And there was like a pretty wide variety of like what people were into. Like with any place else, there's like some people really into the painting scene. There were some really cool sculptors. There were a couple of really great art prizes that would happen each year, like Sondheim or like the Baker's Art Prize. And the Baltimore Museum of Art, I think, put on pretty good work. I really liked that museum. I really liked the Walters Museum too, which was like, I think, I forget all the info about it, but I think it was just like some guy who was really rich and had this like huge home eventually was like, just turned my whole estate into a museum afterwards. And now I think that's more or less how the Walters had happened.
mm,
Um, and there's like a couple of like maybe more blue chippy gallery spaces, but for the most part, it's very DIY artist run spaces.
yeah,
Um, so seeing like several models of different spaces, and also because Baltimore was like an industrial city, so many big, beautiful warehouses that people were able to turn out into like live workspaces or like studio warehouse spaces that then had a huge gallery underneath of it. So just stuff like that. Like I always loved being in an industrial building that wasn't really like super polished to look like a gallery. It's like, here's all this like old random machinery that we can't move because it's too expensive and heavy to move, but also here's this really beautiful video work being projected right next to it. And
Yeah.
spaces like that, I think, were really important to how I was thinking of just experiencing art in general.
Well, the I was a raver in the 90s, and or I mean, I guess you never stop, but that was the first time, because like the rave scene was all in Miami was mostly clubs and like smaller venues and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That was the first time I went to like a warehouse rave, and those were mythical in the East Coast at the time because they happened apparently at the West Coast, and people were like, so. But it was funny to me because when I met ravers up there and I told them that I was from Miami, they were like more fascinated with my scene because my scene was small and pure and whatever, you know. It's so funny, but I was like, but I didn't see the warehouse side on the art side, but on the rave side, like I had never been to a rave that big, like in a venue that fucking large, and it was crazy. It was really cool, and it was packed too, which was insane. And there was a really bad DJ, which was kind of a surprise to me. Like someone kept train wrecking. I was like, in front of this many people, this is insane. Like multiple train wrecks. But yeah, it's a beautiful city. I really I only want the best for it because it's like it does seem like it's a hard place to live.
Mm-hmm.
It like for the reasons that you've already covered, especially for the majority of the population that lives there. Yeah.
Yeah, and the redlining is so intense too. Like, especially when I was an Uber Lyft driver, there would be moments where, like, like any city, there are streets that run parallel to each other. So, like, on one side, you could have Greenmount Avenue, which has a lot of like homes or businesses that were like owned by Black folks, and like are beginning, or like, sort of like this beginning marker of like everything beyond this is starting to get a little dilapidated. Whereas one block away, right next to it, is St. Paul, and that's like very nice, like very kind of like finessed, beautiful homes with like patios, like, not just like the skinny row house style, but it's still those houses that are all connected, but like they have like mini yards and like people hang out on their patios and like smoke their cigarettes or like drink their coffee or whatever. And there's trees around them. It's like so beautiful. And people would like complain if I took Greenmount Avenue because I would just take wherever the GPS led me. I was like,
Yeah.
I'm just following this, and that's my only explanation for where we're going.
Yeah.
And one time, this like kind of like uppity white couple like complained that I was on Greenmount Avenue instead of St. Paul, and they're like, "You could have just gone one street over, and it'd be a lot nicer looking." And I'm like, "We're going to the same place, and it's not like anyone is gonna like come and like pull us out of the car and steal this right now." So I don't really know what you're thinking about. Like, we like just have to acknowledge that like this is like a very like intensely redlined city.
No, for sure, for sure. I mean, you covered that with what you were explaining earlier with the it just seems like I don't know. I love it's so crazy like how I'm starting to think about cities, I love LA. I love the people in it, but I hate the city how it's run, and I think that Baltimore has that, like it's almost like the resiliency of the people in it, the real people, especially like I'm talking about in LA, like, there's this idea of what LA people are like, but most of those people that talk about that don't really interact with locals, like people that were born and raised here that have no interaction with the movie industry, no interaction with any industry that's like that, like people that are here for generations and can barely afford, like will never be able to buy a house in their own city that they grew up in, like that is the people that like just completely get unacknowledged, so that's what was interesting about that. I will give that to The Wire definitely covered some of the strife, of that city. I don't know how great it is to just kind of exclusively focus on just how many people are drug dealers,
Right.
But that show, you know what? That show did have a big character who was Omar, who was a tough guy that used to rob drug dealers, and he was gay, and he like would make out with his, he always had like a young thing with him. So it was an interesting thing. I don't even know if that's why I asked you about how it. Well, I asked you just because you're queer, about queerness in that city. But that actor has said since that like people would go up to him and like, yo, Omar is like a fucking gangster, like just loving him. And the actor was just like, well, he's a queer, queer character and people love him, So it's an interesting show. I might actually start watching it again. I've only watched it once, and people rewatch that shit all the time. Maybe I'll have a nicer review for it. I think the first time I watched it, my expectations were so high because I was literally sitting next to someone who was like, "Oh my god, this show's so great," and I was like, "Okay."
I feel like that energy is what makes me like not watch shows. My spouse and I both share this. We're like, when something is really popular and everyone wants us to watch it, we're like, no, we're not watching.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
all we hear about, and then maybe like 2 years later, we're like, should we watch this now that no one's talking about it? And then we're like, wow, that actually was good, or like, maybe it didn't live up to all the hype or whatever.
But you're also from the city, and as somebody who's from Florida, and is like fucking Dexter was one of the worst Miami shows. In fact, I was telling my mom I want to do like one of those tier lists, S tier, A tier, and I just watched the show. Is there like an air conditioner going off in your apartment? There's
I
just
think
a white note
on my computer.
Oh, that's the fan on your computer. No worries. If there's nothing that can be done, it's just a white noise, so it's not a big deal. So I was my friend recommended a new Vince Vaughn show on Apple TV called Bad Monkey, and I was like, I like Vince Vaughn, but I'm not a huge crazy fan. But then she told me it's in Florida. Immediately, I was like, okay, I'm watching it. So I started to watch it, and as I'm watching it, I'm like, the vibe, like I don't like the way the show's directed, but the writing and the acting and all of that, like it's really Florida to the point where I was like, oh, this reminds me of Carl Hiaasen. And then I was like, oh, this is based on a Carl Hiaasen book, who's one of the legendary writers about what Florida culture is actually like. So when you find that, it's so nice to feel seen. And then the one that I'll give a pass to that's from Florida is the new Roadhouse movie with Jake Gyllenhaal. There's nothing dramatically accurate happens in that movie. Like, there's no fights in Florida at that level. Like, people don't just beat the shit out of each other in bars. There's no like motorcycle gangs, or maybe there are, but I don't know. There's the illicit business. It's a small community. It's really hard to fucking imagine that being the case. Maybe I'm wrong, but the way that they shot that fucking city, like the keys, and they just made up a key, but the way that they shot it just gives me that feeling of being there, of that just like, that home, like that air, you can smell the ocean air and stuff. So I don't know, maybe you get back to me and tell me if you're nostalgic, for that. Because the Carl Hiaasen stuff, everybody's corrupt. There's a bunch of shitty people in the show. Nobody's a good human being in the character, but they're Miami or they're Florida specific people,
What was you mentioned like Dexter not being a good representation of Miami. What was your like feelings about that?
Okay, for just the first thing that pops into mind is I could tell that show was like they would maybe do some exterior shit out there, but it was never shot in Miami. Most of like 100%, all the interiors were out here. They maybe shot outside of his. But the other thing that I would notice is cultural things. Like, right, they go and there's one scene where they're talking about a coyote. And a coyote, for people that don't know, that aren't from LA, is somebody that smuggles people across the border. But that's not what Cubans call that. We call that hermanos al rescate, because our thing is we used to have before wet foot, dry foot. We used to have which Obama implemented. You actually had to get a foot on land to get exile. So he actually he was not good on immigration, on many other things, specifically on that. He restricted immigration for Cubans. So before that, there was a thing called Brothers to the Rescue, Hermanos al Rescate, which were Cubans that would fly on planes to try to catch rafters, to make sure that, then they would spot them, they would get them help. Because when people hop on those rafts, what happens is that they'll get the Gulf Stream, but if they ride the Gulf Stream too much, it sends them right back into the Atlantic. So you kind of want to catch. So there used to be a vigil. That's what like a coyote is. That's not, but that's not a coyote, right? Because they're not smuggling people into the country, the people are already eligible to get asylum. So like little cultural things like that I knew that like, oh, this was written by somebody that doesn't know shit about Miami.
Mm-hmm.
And so but the saving grace of The Wire, the last 15 minutes of the show is all Wire. but The Wire was written by somebody that you could tell actually had a love for the city and wanted to uncover it. It's Carl Hiaasen is a mystery novelist, and there's a lot of humor in the stuff, right? Whereas like The Wire is a lot more dour, you know. Whereas like Hiaasen is like, oh, look at all these crazy fucking Florida people, all these archetypes that are 100% accurate. And if you've lived in Florida, you met these people versus like, you know, and it's fun because that's kind of how Miami is. But like Baltimore is just like, oh, everybody's life sucks, dude, you know,
Yeah.
in the show, which I don't think necessarily reflects everybody's life. But
Yeah, there are definitely like, as someone who also was like a dog walker in Baltimore as like my side hustle when I wasn't like on my semesters for school or whatever, it would be kind of interesting seeing like, and it was predominantly like who can afford a dog walker, right? It was like mostly like white families who had been in Baltimore or like maybe were transplants in Baltimore. There was definitely like some neighborhoods where it's like, oh, this like old, whatever this old factory is, now we're turning it into this like hip apartment building where you're living next to the industrialization and we're going to call it, I don't know, the silo, because there's like a silo attached to it. And it's like, okay, cool. But then you see the apartments and they're like cool hip lofts or something. And then again, like just a couple blocks away are like the kind of like not so well taken care of houses. But it would just be like interesting seeing all of these homes and like kind of like the ways that people sort of categorized what was very Baltimore. And I don't know if this is such a thing in Florida or in Miami, but like people in Maryland have such strong Maryland pride. Like the Maryland flag is over everyone's like cars, their homes. They're like, they probably have a hoodie. That's the whole flag.
The only place that I've seen that other than Baltimore is here in California.
Yeah.
Where you see the California for the longest time, I would read those shirts and be like, "What's NIA?" And it's just the word California broken up into syllables.
Yeah. It's like so weird and funny. But then I'm just kind of like, it's interesting because I'm like, I don't know. It feels like kind of creepy to talk about like what you can gather by like standing in someone's living room while you're like trying to put a leash on their dog to take them out to pee. But I'm like, I can tell you are like people who are maybe like just like not so invested in the city that you've like placed yourself within. And like oftentimes I would get a really good sense of like, oh, you're like a transplant, like you have just moved here for like some job in the Baltimore City area or something. And something like honestly that Mika and I have talked a lot about too, like, you know, maybe bringing it back to Harvest and Gather is like, we are both transplants in San Diego, like Mika's from the Valley, I'm from Baltimore. And so it's like, oh, how do we move through this city that already has had this art scene that has been existing for decades? And what do we do to like move respectfully within it and like not undercut other people who have already been here and maybe have like those like scrappy spaces that where we're like, you know, we're never marketing ourselves as like the only scrappy project around.
No.
You know, it's kind of like, oh, with like something like an MFA program at a school like UCSD, so many people come. And I was also guilty of this too, where it's like, oh, I'm going to go to this school because it's what I need. But then it's so close to LA. And I feel like similarly with Baltimore, people would not have their eyes on Baltimore as a city to stay in long term. They're like, well, from here, I'm just going to move up to New York 3 hours away.
Yeah.
And that's going to be my route. Or like maybe occasionally someone moves like down to DC an hour away, maybe even Philly. But in San Diego, everyone just has their eyes on LA. And it's almost like sad because they're ignoring the potential that is in San Diego. And that's something where like Mika and I are always thinking about like seeing MFA students now that come and go, now that we're out of the program. They're always like, oh, there's always a few where like, you know, we need to be in LA every weekend, every other weekend. We got to see these shows. We got to network and make connections. And it's kind of like, well, you could also like do a little bit of that here. So many people are living and working here and they have their galleries in LA, but they just live here.
Oh, so, wow.
Yeah.
Like artists that are represented in LA, you mean? Or people that run spaces?
Yeah. I like probably like the representation.
Hmm.
Um, I know there are like, professors are like a funny different thing. A lot of our professors who teach here maybe have like an apartment here, but they like really live and work in LA sort of vibe. Um, but
That's an unfortunate thing, but I think that like LA was like that until recently too. Until the last like I think around 2012 is when the mega there's something weird that happens when mega spaces come and blue chip galleries are around that sort
yeah.
of legitimizes everything else, which is a weird thing. But
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know. I was looking at the while you were talking, I was looking at the like you guys are San Diego's probably proper, not county, and LA proper, not LA County. Are it's like 3 million versus 3 million something, maybe approaching 4 million. What did I see for LA? Here is the last one. LA, yeah, it's 3.8 million and 1.3 million for San Diego in 2023. So it is one of those things where like unfortunately those cities like New York, there's the five cities, right? It's Paris, New York, LA, Hong Kong, and what's the last one? I always forget the fifth one. But it doesn't matter. It's basically those are the big like art market cities, and there is such a saturation of artists here that it might actually get you a better opportunity to be seen as a smaller scrappy project, because there's so many scrappy projects here. I could do an entire show on scrappy projects out. I could do exclusively scrappy projects, never interview an artist, and I don't know when I would run out,
Mm.
of because everybody's running something out of their living room and stuff like that, right? So that is a nice thing, but I totally agree with you. Like I'm from Miami. Miami has its own self-contained scene that is completely independent of what happens during Basel. Everybody just works for Basel and makes money, like as art handlers and stuff. But when it comes down to it, that community is so different than anything that happens out here. And that's the other thing that's interesting. People that are from New York come out here and they're like, "Oh, this is very different," right? So
Mhm.
that's the importance of having those things sprout up. But yeah, we've been going for a while, man. I don't know if you know this, but we've been talking for an hour and 16. Let me ask you the wrap up question, which is there anything that I haven't asked you yet that you maybe it's okay if you say no, but I want to give you the opportunity. We didn't get to talk about video games.
Oh,
Uh,
I was so happy to talk about Harvest and Gather. I was like, oh, Javier has things he wants to talk about. That makes me happy.
Oh yeah, I'm always curious. So is there anything that in preparation you wanted to get out that I didn't have the right question to lay you up?
Mm.
It's okay if you don't.
Well, I guess it's like, I don't know, there's like so much that could like still be said that I'm like, I don't even know which thing.
Yeah,
I
an hour is so limiting. That's why we went a little bit over because
Yeah.
it doesn't feel like we're ready to end. But I do, I do like to keep them to an hour because that gives the opportunity to have people back, and I've been doing that. So, well, cool. Anything that we can promote for you?
Well, for Harvest and Gather, Mika and I have been working on a curatorial show at a more formal institution. So, although we run on a very DIY model, we have been reached out to by a more historical institution called the Athenaeum Music and Arts Library. And they're based in La Jolla. They also have a satellite location that's like a smaller gallery in Logan Barrio Heights area in San Diego. But so they asked us a few months ago to curate a show. And as with anything, Mika and I are always thinking about like, well, what can we do with our very modest platform? Like, what is this actually going to generate for the artists that we asked to be involved? And Mika came up with this idea of misconnections, like from Craigslist. And so then we were like, ooh, like what can we do with that? We both love Craigslist, like have found so many good things on it. And then it became this sort of like idea of like the original misconnections post, right? Or kind of like someone where like you like had this moment of like love at first sight and you didn't get to connect with them. And so you post this maybe poetic thing in hopes that they will just like also be looking and like find it very much like that. What is it? The Pina Coladas and whatever song that
Yeah,
is.
yeah. If you
Um,
like pina coladas,
yes,
yeah,
that
yeah.
one. So then we were like,
I always thought of that. I always thought of that as like the guys that didn't have the courage to approach, and then they were like kicking themselves. Whereas if you just approach and then you're like, no, okay, thank you, and you walk away, and then you don't have to dwell on it. Express your interest, and then get rejected, and then you don't have to fucking. But anyway, go ahead.
like lamenting over missing a chance over something that it's like it wouldn't have happened anyway.
Exactly.
So
That's why get rejected so you know it wasn't going to happen instead of all this like fantasizing.
exactly. So with this show, we're sort of like, what are the artist misconnections? So we invited 4 people who then created this list of their misconnections of artists where they were like, we almost worked together, but like things didn't align, or like this would be like my dream artist within like reason that I could work with or something.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's kind of how we prefaced it. So we have 8 artists who are sort of working in pairs to have their works in a very specific conversation. And so we're like, okay, like beyond just curating, we hope that this maybe fosters like a friendship or professional working relationship where like now you guys are like in a more formal conversation with each other's practices. But so
it reminds me a little bit of the IKEA residency over here, where artists are paired together to collaborate. Although it's not the misconnections is not is your own unique spin, which I appreciate.
Yeah, I didn't realize the IKEA residency paired people.
Yeah, it's basically they pair people, and then they're like supposed to meet once to discuss the project at IKEA and have like a meal there. I don't really know all the details. All I know is that I'm a huge fan. Mary Boo is from Florida, and she is like one of the most punk people that is like super low key that I really appreciate. Like, yeah. But that's all I'm gonna say. But I'm a huge fan of hers, and she's super punk. Especially like, yeah, I mean, you don't. I'm not saying anything out of school here. This is the IKEA residency is a literal guerrilla residency that's cool as shit. But anyway, so that when is that?
That will open on April 25th, and it'll be running until maybe like mid-July this year.
Cool.
So 3-month exhibition. We'll be doing a little curator walkthrough the day after it opens, the 26th, on a Saturday, maybe at 2 p.m. For anyone who wants to be in La Jolla. And then otherwise, we'll probably have like an artist panel / curator talk or something.
Yeah.
But beyond that, we're sort of just focusing on that exhibition and then the OPAF South organizing, which again is just something where like, you know, we had such a good time at OPAF and we're so inspired. And then when we were wrapping up, Mika was like, you should come down to San Diego. And Kay was like,
Kay is like ready for it.
Yeah, she's in San Diego. I did want to do a South iteration.
Yeah. She's done a North one too.
Yeah, it's crazy how sometimes organizing is just like asking questions until the right people say yes.
Well, then also the other thing I was going to say that relates to something that we kind of touched on about different size cities, right? Like if you were doing Harvest and Gather here in LA, you probably wouldn't have had that institution, that visibility, right? So where there's a thirst for that, it's a good place to do it. Like, right? It's about demand. There is way too much supply of artists here where like even like I said, there are elements of the fucking LA art scene with people that have never crossed paths with me. Have never crossed paths with anybody I know. It's just that fucking big. Like it's literally massive. And so visibility in a space like this is very, very difficult. So if you're an artist in a small city and you're like, everything sucks because I don't live in LA, it's like, nah, man. You got people and you got opportunities in your own town, man. And when those scenes are small, it's really easy to know everybody. And if you're agreeable, it's a really good place to be.
Yeah. And like sometimes people are complaining about what the scene is or isn't. And it's like, you have all the power to start something to make the scene more of what you want to see. The issue that I think Mika and I have been meditating on is that there are so many, like there's a fair amount of artists in San Diego and not so many spaces or projects. And no one really wants to bite the bullet to become someone who is organizing both their own space and like maintaining their own individual art practice. Like there's a few, like Joe Yordi runs Best Practice with Ali Munt, and then Lizzie Zelter, who's a painter, runs 2 Rooms. But, you know, it's just like one of those things where like it just wears you down. So easily, like doing it for a certain amount of time, which again
Yeah.
is why I'm grateful that I get to do it with like another person.
Well, the AI saved this podcast. There's no the amount of work that I used to do, I forget the amount of work that I used to do on my own, and like just hoping that someday I would make enough money to pay somebody is
Mm-hmm.
like, you know, that is longevity, and sustainability is a very difficult thing to navigate. And I watch this show that I always like plugging because it's an artist that's in Austin. Her name is Jenna Sparrow. She has the Bad Art podcast. And even she does something that I used to do, which is like she records. I used to feel bad about this, but now seeing someone else doing it with success is crazy. She records more than 1 hour and then splits it up into two parts like I used to, you know. And I used to do that just to make it sustainable, because it's a lot of work, you know. Like this week I interviewed 2 different people. That ties me up, you know. So all of that post-production being handled by AI is like amazing, you know. So yeah, definitely make it sustainable. Don't burn yourself out on your project, because you're just going to be bitter, you know. So
Exactly.
but congratulations to you guys.
Yeah.
I guess I'm sorry. I still have like some very gendered language in programmed in me from being an old guy. But yeah, congratulations to you both, and yeah, I wish you all the best with OPAF South. I'm here to support, and anything that you guys need, let me know. Where can people find you?
What's that?
Where can people find you?
Oh, they can find me individually. My website is just catgunn.com. So catgunn.com. I'm only on Instagram. I really can't handle much social media, and I can barely handle Instagram, but I'm at mango hot sauce with 2 underscores between each word.
Okay.
Yeah. And then harvest and gather. We're harvest and gather, or harvest and gather.
With the letter N?
Yeah, with the letter N. And we
Instead
just
of and.
that's linked on our Instagram, and I think it's like harvest dash and dash gather slash whatever that Squarespace extra thing is when you don't pay.
Okay.
Just
You got to make it sustainable, dude. I'm still on Podbean. I don't have my own website for the podcast, so well, cool. And then well, thank you guys for watching. If you guys enjoyed this conversation, like and subscribe, rate us 5 stars, and write us a review wherever you can. Comment wherever there's a comment box. Specifically YouTube helps a lot. And we got Patreon. $5 a month gets you early access, and actually really, really helps us. I need to get better about every time you add something new, you forget, and you have to add it to your workflow. But I need to put the Patreon scroll, but you will get on that too, shouting everybody out. And yeah, we'll be back next week with another guest and another topic that may or may not be art related. Thank you so much, Kat. This was a really good conversation, and I'm excited for what's happening in San Diego when San Diego's got caretakers like you and Mika.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. This was great.
My pleasure. And I'm gonna end recording.